Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Sundowner webinar series presented by the Grassland Society of Southern Africa. Following a very successful virtual conference in June, we decided to implement the Sundowner webinar series to enable our members during this time of limited personal contact to be able to communicate with each other, to facilitate dissemination of science, and to facilitate discussion around topical issues. So for this first webinar, we're very privileged to have Dr. Alan Knapp from Colorado State University join us. Alan is a very prominent ecologist, well known around the world for his work in grasslands and grassland ecology, and much of his work has a strong physiological slant to it. Alan is well known. He's published a lot. He's had a number of really good students pass through his laboratories, and most of those students are still on good terms with him. And Alan is going to talk about a very interesting topic this afternoon entitled When What Should Happen Doesn't: Unexpected Grassland Responses to Extreme Drought in North America. Alan, we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Kevin, for that introduction. I'd like to begin also by thanking the Grassland Society of Southern Africa for this invitation to visit with you all today in this webinar format. And I'd like to congratulate Kevin. I didn't realize he had been named the new president of the GSSA, so congratulations, Kevin. And again, thanks for the invitation to share some research with you all today. My goal today is to share a bit of a detective story with you, essentially provide the background for some research that we've done recently with regard to these unexpected grassland responses to drought in North America. And it's the background story for this paper that we published about a month or two ago called Resolving the Dust Bowl Paradox in North America that I published along with many co-authors. And the background story goes something like this. So as Kevin mentioned, I am a faculty member at Colorado State University, and I teach in the graduate degree program in ecology. And one of the favorite classes that I get to teach in this program is ECOL 505, Foundations of Ecology. This is for the first year graduate students in ecology at Colorado State University. And we cover a wide range of topics in this class. But one of my favorite lectures to give is what I call the It Just Makes Sense lecture, or examples of where what you think should happen doesn't necessarily happen in the ecological sciences. And in this lecture, we cover three basic stories, examples of when something should happen but doesn't happen. One has to do with the mountain ranges that we have in Colorado. Colorado has a lot of high mountain peaks. The grad students and, of course, the faculty, we spend a lot of time up in the mountains, either hiking or running. We all know that when you get at high elevation, the air seems thinner, lower partial pressures of oxygen and, of course, CO2. We feel this in our physiology as we get at high elevation. We know humans acclimate. And one of the questions we ask is, what about plants? Do plants do the same sorts of things, or have the same sorts of acclimation and physiological stresses due to this thin air at high elevation that humans do? So we talk about that. A second It Just Makes Sense lecture has to do with elevated CO2 concentrations. We know they're increasing. In this class, we discuss a bit about C3 and C4 physiology, physiological differences between those photosynthetic pathways, the expectation being that elevated CO2 should benefit C3s more than C4s due to these physiological differences. So it just makes sense that you might see increases in C3s in the field. And then we again discuss how the empirical data oftentimes suggests that this isn't the case. So what should happen doesn't always appear to happen. And then the third story that I share in this lecture is this Dust Bowl paradox that I want to talk about today. Now, I realize that many of you, especially those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, aren't intimately aware of the grasslands of North America and in the central United States in general, so I want to spend a little bit of time reminding you of the geography and the scale of these grasslands. So this is a map of the central part of the United States, the Central Plains grasslands. We have this high mountain range, the Rocky Mountains here, indicated by the little black triangles on the western edge of the grasslands. They create a rain shadow, so we tend to have short, low productivity, dry grasslands in the rain shadow of the mountains, and then rainfall increases from west to east, and the grasslands become more productive. Species changes. Generally, most of the agriculture in the United States occurs, of course, in the wetter, more productive grasslands. So many of these grasslands have been lost to agriculture. The scale of this system, 800 to 1,000 kilometers or so in scale from the mountains to where eventually you grade from grasslands into forest. And the region I want to talk about in particular today for the Dust Bowl paradox is essentially this bullseye region here in the central part of the United States, where, as we'll discuss, some really interesting responses in the grasses to drought occurred. Now, this is a slide directly from the lecture I give to class from Foundations of Ecology. So for them, I do the same sort of things I just did for you. I point out the dry to wet gradient in precipitation across the Great Plains and the shift in grassland types from low productivity to high productivity across the central United States. I also point out to them the temperature gradient that occurs from north to south. In our hemisphere, in our part of the world, so it's cooler here, much warmer down in the southern part of the United States, at least certainly during the growing season, that's the case. And as a result of both these precipitation and temperature gradients, we tend to see this gradient in C3 dominance of the grasslands to C4 dominance of the grasslands in this general direction here. So essentially from northwest to southeast, we see this gradient in the relative abundances of these different photosynthetic types. Now, I didn't remind them or introduce them to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, this decade of record high heat and record low rainfall in the Great Plains in this region here. I had them think about the key differences in C3 and C4 physiologies, now in particular related to temperature relations and water relations, so we go over that in class. I point out to them that there was a famous, at least in North America, famous grassland ecologist by the name of John Weaver, who was at the University of Nebraska, essentially right at this point right here, who studied the grasslands. This was his world during the 1930s, and so he spent the decade and beyond studying these grasslands. And I asked him to tell me what do they think he observed as he monitored these grasslands and studied the community composition of these grasslands through this record period of heat and drought. What do they think happened to these grasslands? What do they predict that he would have observed happening in response to the drought? And of course, it seems relatively simple after we go over, as we've gone over the differences between C3s and C4 grasses in general. The answer always is almost unanimously by the class, the C3 grasses are expected to decrease in response to the high temperatures and low rainfall. And you might expect the C4 grasses to expand. So almost all the students say this unanimously. And indeed, when you discuss it with most grassland ecologists, you get the same answer. And as I point out to them, that is wrong. That's exactly the opposite of what we observed during this time, hence the Dust Bowl paradox. And I tell them this should be surprising to them as it is, because we've been studying drought since the 1920s in North America. So we have well over 100 years of studies of drought in this part of the world and these grasslands. And we even know that drought has been identified as one of the key attributes the climate of these regions that allowed for the rise and maintenance of grasslands in North America. So, excuse me, we know a lot about drought, and we know drought's been incredibly important in these systems, and yet our predictions were generally wrong. I didn't point out to them that the beauty of science is that many important things are predictable. Quote from Freeman Dyson, and I turn that around from an ecological perspective and say that the beauty of ecology is when we're wrong, that's when we often learn things. So unpredictability tended to precede new insights into what's important in structuring the systems we're interested in. And I usually leave them with a cartoon, something like this, pointing out that it's okay to be wrong, that we're all wrong in sciences in general. Certainly we tend to be wrong in ecology a lot. And this cartoon sort of exemplifies that, although I do point out to them that providing a detailed tribute to your wrongness, it's probably not a good career move overall, but they need to recognize that many of us have been wrong in our predictions in the past, and it's likely to happen in the future because, of course, ecological systems are so complex. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the 1930s Dust Bowl drought. Again, it's a really well-known decadal-scale climate extreme in North America and the United States. This is just a picture of the Palmer Drought Index in 1934 showing how widespread the drought was across the United States in that particular year. The Dust Bowl is of interest to us today because it represents a climate extreme or an extreme climatic period, which are expected to increase with climate change in the future. And so by looking back at what happened in the past, perhaps we can gain some insight about how our systems might respond to these climate extremes becoming more frequent and perhaps even more severe in the future. All right, so the Dust Bowl is a really iconic event. It really defined a generation in the United States, had a huge impact on the social fabric of the United States, on the economics of the United States. There have been many documentaries written or produced about the Dust Bowl, best-selling books written about how people dealt with the Dust Bowl, Hollywood movies. Best-selling author John Steinbeck wrote a book detailing what happened to one family as they essentially left the area of the Dust Bowl and moved to the West Coast. And indeed, my family, my grandparents did exactly the same thing. They were in the middle of the United States during the Dust Bowl, and they essentially moved to the West Coast during that time. And it gets its name, the Dust Bowl, as you can see from these photos here, because of the agricultural practices at the time, leaving fields uncovered, and then the wind picked up the topsoil and essentially blew and deposited topsoil all over the Midwest. If you just want to Google Dust Bowl 1930s and look for images, you'll see some amazing pictures of the dust deposition that occurred during this time. So we know a lot about the social impacts, the ecological impacts. They've been well detailed, and this is known by the American public quite well. What's less well appreciated is what happened ecologically. And these were detailed by the person I mentioned earlier, the person I mentioned in my class, John Weaver, an amazing grassland ecologist at the University of Nebraska, spent almost all of his career there. He was a very prolific writer, wrote over 100 papers and 11 books, and he essentially documented what happened during this decade of drought to the grasslands in the Midwest. And so just some of the titles of his papers, you can get a sense for how detailed he was. He began by detailing the first responses of these grasslands to the Great Drought. This one in 1934. Weaver was convinced that these grasslands were incredibly resilient and could withstand any sort of challenge nature put upon them. Certainly his view changed as he watched what happened during these grasslands during this time. So we talked about the initial response, the deterioration of the Midwestern range, how it affected the grasslands in Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. These are the three states that I had circled on the earlier map. The actual replacement of one type of grassland by another as the drought extended into a decadal time scale. And he was there, of course, after the drought was over to survey what happened at the end and to follow its recovery as well. And although he wrote a lot of papers, he also wrote these two really interesting books, which also summarize all of his work and provide additional insight into what happened in these grasslands during this great drought. And so I want to provide a couple quotes from these books initially for you, just to give you a sense of what this drought was like. So what did Weaver and his students document? So this is a direct quote from this book. It said, 4 days in the middle of July 1936 served to impress one with the severity of physical and biotic factors so extreme that even native vegetation could not endure them uninjured. Again, he was convinced that native vegetation would be incredibly resistant to drought, and he proved to be wrong. He talked about the temperatures, described the temperatures being over 44 degrees C, low humidities, strong winds, glaring sunlight, subnormal precipitation, combined to where when you walked across these grasslands during the peak of the drought, essentially what was left of the grasses crackled underfoot, as he mentioned, like wheat stubble. And then he also mentioned that there were hordes of grasshoppers in these systems. So there was overgrazing that happened in these systems as the local ranchers tried to keep their cattle alive. Grasshoppers exploded in their populations, creating a real biotic stress on these systems as well. And then at the end of one of his chapters, though, he makes this statement, which is what I want to focus on for the rest of the talk. He said there was a remarkable panorama of change from one grassland to another, and this was vividly portrayed, as he pointed out, on a grand scale during these terrible drought years from 33 to 41. And that's really what I want to talk about next.
So I want to talk a bit about that panorama of change, if you will. And again, these are some more direct quotes from his writings. He pointed out that the pre-drought vegetation consisted mostly of bluestems, with only a small amount of wheatgrass. These are the common names of the species he was studying in those days. He was very distraught to see little bluestems succumbing to drought in 34, big bluestem disappearing by 1940, and then this wheatgrass actually rapidly increasing each year throughout much of the area he was studying. And then he concluded that the replacement of the true prairie by mixed prairie, so true prairie is more productive, mixed prairie was less productive, occurred over a vast area. An area that was 160 to 250 kilometers in width across 3 states, and a front that was almost 1,600 kilometers in length. And he provided photographic evidence of this. I don't know if this is him or not in this grassland, but the caption reads, "This is near where his university was, how a site, a grassland formerly dominated by this bluestem species, had been completely replaced by this wheatgrass species." And he provides many, many pictures of these visualizations, if you will, of these changes in vegetation. And so essentially what he's describing was, as you might expect, more xeric or drier vegetation moving from west to east and increasing or replacing the more productive plants that were resident in the more mesic parts of the Great Plains. And then he also pointed out that this drought, after it lasted for 10 years, took almost 20 years to recover. And he said 2 decades were required for the replacement of these drought dominants, the wheatgrass, and to get them back to their usual place as being just subdominant interstitial species as opposed to being dominant species. So he did a great job of describing both the impacts of the drought and what happened afterwards. Now, this drought-induced replacement of the bluestems that Weaver was talking about by this wheatgrass and other species is the paradox that I want to talk about. And it's a paradox for the following reason. That those dominant grasses, the formerly dominant grasses, were all C4s. The bluestems are C4 species, and western wheatgrass and many of the other species that displaced them were C3 species. Now this is the point where the students essentially look like this in class, because of course we've just talked about the various differences between C3 and C4 grasses, where we've reviewed how C4 photosynthesis essentially has a higher temperature optimum from a physiological perspective, and that C3 photosynthesis actually markedly declines as temperatures get too high, temperatures that were similar to what was experienced during this drought. If you grow them side by side, typically, not always, but oftentimes water use efficiency is higher in C4 species. And if you just look at where C3 and C4 grasslands occur across the globe, right, C4 species are always likely to be dominant. If they are dominant, they're going to be dominant in the warmer climates, and the C3 species are what dominate essentially all the cool regions of the world. And so we conclude by saying there's really nothing about their traits or their distribution, or we talk about their evolutionary history as well, that would actually result in you predicting that if you have 10 years of extreme hot drought, C3s would actually do better and displace the C4 grasses. Now, it's important to point out this wasn't a paradox to Weaver at all, and the reason it wasn't is because C4 photosynthesis was not discovered during his lifetime. He died in 1966, the same year that we first discovered the differences between these two physiological pathways. And so he just viewed this as one more drought, what he viewed as one more drought-tolerant grass replacing a less drought-tolerant species in the middle of the country. And so it really wasn't a paradox to him. This has become a paradox after we've learned of these two photosynthetic pathways and the unusual way in which one replaced the other. But it turns out this was not just observed during the Dust Bowl. There was a nice paper written by Jim Clark and his colleagues, published in Ecology in 2002. They were looking at pollen deposits in lakes in the northern parts of the Central Plains grassland region. And they were looking, of course, over long time periods, looking at the vegetation shifts before, during, and after a number of different droughts historically. And after one drought, he pointed out this, although both C3 and C4 grasses decline during droughts, just like most species decline during droughts, a lasting shift to C3 dominance occurred during a single drought about 80 to 100 years ago. And so he pointed out that this has happened in the past in the Great Plains as well. All right, so how do we resolve this unexpected grassland response? So the next part of the story, it has to do with sort of our inadvertently replicating the Dust Bowl drought. So in 2015, we initiated an experiment that we call the EDGE experiment. EDGE stands for Extreme Drought in Grasslands Experiment. This is actually a 6-site experiment designed to look at how grasslands across the Great Plains, how differentially sensitive they might be to drought. And we realized after we set this up that 2 of the sites that we had, which are indicated here on this particular map, actually were well situated to think about replicating the Dust Bowl, or at least trying to understand these Dust Bowl responses. So I need to spend a little time with this map with you here. This is just a map of the precipitation anomalies during the Dust Bowl. So the greatest precipitation anomalies, where this is sort of the bullseye of the driest part of the Dust Bowl drought. This is just a sort of another level of precipitation anomalies. And anything in the yellow is an area where there were significant reductions in precipitation compared to normal during the drought. And then we've also shown on here again this northwest to sort of southeast range of C3 dominance here in the cooler north and more C4 dominance to the south. So these two sites in particular, it turns out, were well positioned. One actually in the Dust Bowl bullseye, and the other more on the edge of the Dust Bowl to actually look at how 4 years of extreme drought might affect C3s and C4 grasses. So what made these sites particularly valuable is the site here in Wyoming. This dot here was 70% C3. That C3 dominance was primarily wheatgrass, the grass that Weaver talked about. And then the site in Kansas here in Hays, Kansas was 70% C4, but of the 30% C3s, there was a lot of this wheatgrass present there as well. So we had the basic players, if you will, for what happened during the Dust Bowl occurring naturally at most of these particular sites. So we imposed 4 years of extreme drought. This is what the drought treatments look like. This is, of course, our growing season here, March through August. In the summertime. This is a graph of normal or ambient precipitation for Hays, Kansas, this particular site here, versus our drought treatments. These shelters essentially just remove natural rainfall, so 66% of all rainfall that hits the tops of these drought shelters. About 34% is allowed to filter through. There are strips of clear plastic here, and 66% is deflected away from the plots. And so it's a way to impose drought based upon a natural ambient precipitation regime. And you can see how this drought impacted monthly precipitation values here in Hays, Kansas. So our Dust Bowl treatments, or our drought treatments, then can be contrasted with the actual Dust Bowl to see how good we were, or how comparable we were to the actual Dust Bowl. So that 66% growing season precipitation reduction is about a 45 to 50% reduction in annual precipitation. And again, we did this for 4 years. This is a picture from the Kansas side, again, showing you how well these shelters do it, removing precipitation and eliciting drought responses in this vegetation. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about our treatments versus the Dust Bowl. In this particular graph here, we have annual precipitation versus that C3 grassland in Wyoming, the C4 grassland in the region overall. And I want to point out to you, if you compare the long-term mean versus the Dust Bowl, you can see the reduction in precipitation that occurred then. Those are our treatments that we imposed during the 4-year period. It turns out we actually reduced precipitation more than occurred during the Dust Bowl. And so we actually evoked a little more extreme drought, if you will, at least from a precipitation perspective. But of course, what we didn't change were temperatures, right? The Dust Bowl was also known to be a very hot decade. And if you just compare, for example, the long-term mean of maximum temperatures during the growing season versus the Dust Bowl years versus our experimental drought, you can see that how much higher temperatures were in the Dust Bowl. And of course, our treatments did not replicate that at all. So we replicated precipitation reductions, but not temperature changes. And of course, our drought was 4 years long. The Dust Bowl drought, of course, was closer to a decade. So that's sort of how we contrast or compare our treatments to what actually happened during this well-known drought. So what happened with the C3 and C4 grasses, right? That's the crux of the story here. I want to focus on these just during the last 2 years of this 4-year drought, and I want to focus on these particular diagrams here. This is the ratio of C3 to C4 grasses in terms of productivity at the C3 dominated site and the C4 dominated site, right? And let's just focus again on the last 2 years, and you can see what we saw is this C3 C4 ratio actually increased during this drought. In the C3 grassland, there was a twofold increase in the C3 C4 ratio of grasses, and in the C4 grassland, the one that was in the bullseye of the original Dust Bowl, there's a fivefold increase in the C3 C4 ratio of productivity of these systems. So similar to what was seeing at least the same trajectory as during the Dust Bowl. Now, those ratios can go up either because C3s are increasing or C4s are decreasing. So we can look at that by just contrasting C3 biomass and drought versus control plots through time. O1 would indicate there was no change between drought and control plots over time. As you can see in the C3 grassland, this ratio went up because C4s decreased in response to the drought. But in the C4 grassland, this ratio went up because both C4s were decreasing and C3s were actually increasing as a result of this drought that we imposed. And in fact, that wheatgrass that we've observed, Pascopyrum smithii is its Latin name, actually ANPP increased fivefold by the end of this experiment for that particular species. So we were giving the system less water, and this particular grass was increasing both relative to the C4 grasses and also in an absolute sense. All right, and it's important to point out that this happened with no dust, right, no high temperatures. There was a lot of grazing that went on during the Central Plains during that time. In many cases, overgrazing as the ranchers ran out of forage for their cattle, nor hordes of grasshoppers. So none of those other aspects of the Dust Bowl included this change in moisture. And what's really interesting for us, at least, about the lack of a dust effect is that Weaver was convinced, as well as Weaver students, that this dust burial actually played a huge role in the transition from one grassland type to another. He assumed that this is what killed out the dominant grasses, right? The dust buried them, and it was these other species that were better able to deal with that dust that increased. And so he has lots of quotes where he talks about the mortality effect of these massive piles of dust that would exist across the grassland. All right, so how do we explain this then? How do we explain this increase in C3 grasses, right, in response to our experiment? We're only manipulated water, being consistent with the Dust Bowl drought overall. So to do that, again, we did a little more detective work. We read a lot about the literature of people who have tried to model the distribution of C3s and C4 grasses across the world. There's lots of papers that do this. Most tend to focus on the physiological differences between those species and that relationship to temperature to provide a nice global scale picture of where these grasses exist, where C4s dominate versus C3s dominate. But there's another paper that we happen to read by Winslow et al., less well cited than some of these other approaches to looking at C3 and C4 distributions, which really sort of rung a bell for us. And this paper was talked about the influence of seasonal water availability, really focusing more on water, which is, again, what we manipulated versus temperature. And in this paper, they propose that it's not just temperature, it's the seasonal timing of water availability with temperature that has a major influence on whether C3 grasses or C4 grasses or C3 or C4 species are going to be more successful or not across the globe. And so we decided to delve into our data and into the long-term records to see if this could perhaps explain this Dust Bowl paradox. And this Winslow paper really lays out a very simple idea. That is, cool season precipitation is going to favor, if you get most of your rainfall in the cool months, you're going to favor C3 grasses. If you get most of your rainfall in the warm season months or the warm season, this will favor C4. Photosynthesis. So just to give an example of what that looks like, this is a picture from Southern California, C3 dominated grassland, and this is a picture from South Africa. This, I believe, Kevin, you correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this is from the Ukalinga Research Farm. And so we downloaded data on the long-term records for these two different systems, plotted monthly precipitation as a percent of total versus mean monthly temperature, and you get a nice picture of what they were talking about in this paper. Again, this should really surprise nobody. In Southern California, you're dominated by C3 grasses. All of the rainfall, or certainly most of the rainfall, occurs during the cooler months and decreases during the warmer months. And in South Africa, where you're dominated by C4 species, of course, most of the rainfall occurs during the warmer months and it's relatively dry during the cooler months. So you get this contrasting, very strong contrasting pattern between precipitation seasonality and the success of C3 and C4 species. Now, this is that same graph I've just shown you, sort of inverted and put on a monthly basis. And what I've done is I've inverted the months for South Africa so we can show them on essentially the North American seasonal scale. So again, here's the wet winter months, dry summer months in Southern California. Here's the wet summer months, if you will, in South Africa. But it turns out, and Winslow et al. Point this out, that it doesn't need to be this diametrically opposed in order to see subtle shifts in C3 versus C4 dominance. So this is the same sort of plot, monthly precipitation versus month of the year for the C4 dominated grassland in Kansas and the C3 grassland in Wyoming. And you can see there are indeed seasonality differences, but they're relatively subtle. Yet they still can be important in tipping the favor when you have both C3 and C4 species. This site is more likely to be C3 dominated, and the red site is more likely to be C4 dominated as more of the rainfall occurs during the warmer months. All right, So then let's look at our experiment this way. So the question we had to ask is, did our drought treatments, and in this case inadvertently, also affect the seasonality of precipitation as well as the amount of precipitation? And to do this, I want to show you that these are plots, these are graphs for our experimental treatments. This is the C3 grassland in Wyoming. This is the C4 grassland in Kansas. I've just plotted monthly precipitation versus monthly temperature for you here for these two sites. This is during the 4 years you did the experiment. And you can see if there's a steeper slope, greater dominance of summer rainfall in the C4 grassland, a shallower slope, lesser summer dominance in the C3 grassland. But if you look at what we did with our treatments, because we just removed rainfall during the warm summer months, of course, we flattened this curve, if you will. We reduced that summer dominance of rainfall in both of these grasslands. Now, another way to look at this is just the ratio of precipitation in warm months versus cool months. And you can see at both sites, we did essentially the same thing. We took a summer-dominated rainfall, or at least a warm month-dominated rainfall regime, and we made it much more equitable, where we had more similar amounts of rainfall throughout the year. We did this at both those sites. Now, those were our experimental treatments. We can also ask the same question about natural droughts. Do natural droughts do the same thing at these two sites? Again, same exact graphs. Setups on the graph, C3 grassland, the C4 grassland in Kansas, monthly precip versus monthly temperature. Now we're looking at 100 years of data. Right? The green line is for the long-term mean precipitation patterns in these systems. Again, a steeper slope in the C4 grassland indicating more summer dominance of rainfall, a more shallow slope, a more equitable distribution of rainfall in the C3 grassland. If you just look at the 4 or 5 driest years on record in the last 100 years, we see the same sort of phenomenon happen. We see most of that reduction occurring during the warm summer months, essentially flattening that curve. And again, if we plot warm versus cool season precipitation, once again, we see that we have taken a strongly summer-dominated system and made those precipitation patterns much more equal throughout the seasons. And in fact, if you contrast these two grasslands, this is the C4 long-term mean here, this particular line here, this is the slope, or this is the warm versus cool season precipitation. This is what happens if you look at the driest years. You can see that reduction in dominance by warm season rainfall. It actually made droughts actually result in similar seasonality to what you see during normal years in the C3 grassland. And so we essentially make them equivalent in terms of their amount and the seasonality of rainfall patterns. All right, so the last thing I want to do is move beyond just those two sites and ask this question about how drought affects seasonality of rainfall patterns across the Great Plains. And so we're going to focus on this particular square here. We do this because we wanted to have equal amounts of vegetation in all 4 vegetation categories, from C3 dominant down through C4 dominant. And essentially what we did is we used PRISM climate data, which provides 100-year estimates of precipitation patterns based upon actual rain gauge measurements throughout the region. And we just looked at the slope of that monthly temperature precipitation relationship. So a steeper slope indicates more summer dominance, a more shallow slope, lower slope indicates less summer dominance of rainfall. You can see as you go from C3 dominant all the way to C4 dominant, you can see that the slope gets steeper. So where the C4s do better is where relatively more of the rainfall occurs during the warmer months. And then you can see whether we're looking at the Dust Bowl years across this region or the extreme drought years, the driest years on record, we always see this seasonality flatten out, if you will, reducing primarily summer dominance of rainfall regimes. And indeed, this is what occurred. This was observed by climatologists during the Dust Bowl as well. They pointed out that the largest deficits during the Dust Bowl occurred during the warm season, with almost half of them occurring during the summer months. And so indeed, this is exactly what happened during the Dust Bowl. So to recap, and in this presentation, we know this. We know that C3s and C4s, their success is strongly related not only to temperature, but also to the seasonality of precipitation. If anyone would argue with that. What we learned from our studies is that our experimental drought, in addition to reducing precipitation, also inadvertently, in our case, we didn't plan to do this, shifted the seasonal precipitation pattern to where it was more equitable between cooler versus warmer months. And this likely favored the C3 grasses. And it looks like extreme drought, at least in our part of the world, does the same thing. And if you think about the warm summer temperatures, which we didn't include, that would likely exacerbate this effect, because not only do you have less summer rainfall, it's hotter during that time, and so much more that will evaporate away and be less effective. And this is likely what we think explains this paradoxical responses of C3s in C4s during the Dust Bowl and in our experiment as well. Now, this is interesting to us as grassland ecologists, but is there more to this than just one grass species replacing another? People who don't study grasslands might just describe our results as this, and it turns out we think it is. And we think it is because extreme drought is already known to feed back to the climate. And of course, we worry a lot about climate change now and how extreme drought is not only part of climate change, but can actually feed back to make climate change even more of a problem. And so we've always known for years that drought results in a net release of carbon to the atmosphere. That, of course, can have a feedback effect on the climate. But it looks like, at least again, in central North America, extreme drought can also shift the phenology of the system. C3s and C4 grasses that coexist together have very different phenologies in terms of when they green up and when they brown out. And that might have a huge impact as well. Now, Andrew Richardson wrote a great paper in 2013 where he talked about phenology and phenological control of these feedbacks of the climate system. And I won't go over this diagram with you here, but in essence, he talked about how shifts in phenology, he was thinking primarily in terms of warming, earlier springs, later falls, how they can influence a whole host of important biogeochemical and biophysical factors and feed back to a changing climate. And he ended up this paper with this lament. He said, we lack an understanding of exactly how much a 1 week shift in spring onset or autumn senescence may impact the annual surface energy budget, surface temperatures, or regional patterns. So he was worried about a 1 week change. When we have these kind of shifts from C4s to C3s, we're actually talking about a change in phenology that might be a month or more in duration, and this might happen very quickly. So this is just NDVI, right? The greenness index from satellites versus day of year for C3 grasslands, C4 grasslands, the C3, C4 mix, that's the black line there. And you can see how much, if you shift from a C4 to a C3 grassland, how you change the entire dynamics of when this system is green, when it's interacting with the atmosphere above it. And again, up to a 30-day change in peak greenness that might occur within 5 or 6 years of one of these extreme droughts. So at a much greater rate than temperature change might drive phenological changes. And of course, how these large-scale shifts in phenology, in this case, we talked about an area of 350 kilometers squared, independent of temperature change, are likely to feed back to climates. It is really something we don't know. It's something we're interested in pursuing in the future. Okay, so I think I'm done. I should end with some acknowledgements. Our funding sources for this large EDGE experiment, which we used to try and better understand how Central North America responded to this drought. As you might guess, a project of this size has many, many, many people involved, a lot of students. Rather than just read all their names here for you, I'll list them and then show you pictures of what life is like imposing drought in these grasslands. These grassland sites are dispersed, they're far apart. And of course, you could end and see that both the joys and the exhaustion of field work that exists for the students who really were instrumental in collecting most of this data. Okay, so I'm done. And I thank you very much for your patience and your time. Again, thank you, Kevin, and the Grassland Society of Southern Africa for inviting me. And if there's time, I'd be more than happy to take questions. Thank you very much, everybody.
Alan, thank you very much. That was just so interesting. And I think it really does show that the systems are so complex, and bringing it down to a single variable doesn't necessarily give you the correct answer. So I'd like to open up the floor now to any questions. Please feel free to open up your chat box or your question and answer box, type in a question, or you could raise your hand, and if Franny's around, she can unmute you, and let's have some questions. So I'll give you a minute to do that. So while we wait for the questions to come in, Alan, I have one. So do you think there are other variables that can act like drought in a major way like this and change an expected outcome of vegetation changes?
So what other variables are you talking about or asking about?
No, I'm asking, do you think there are any others? Yeah.
Great. So I think there are. For example, I think land management would interact with these variables a lot. One of the limitations of this particular experimental approach is, of course, we don't include many of the land management actions that are present in grasslands today in the central U.S., grazing being one of them, and how grazing might either exacerbate or mute the effects of these kind of droughts? It was really an interesting question, one that's a real challenge to get at experimentally, as you might guess, because it's outside of using scissors, which we all know does a very poor job of replicating the actual grazing activities of large animals. It's really difficult to conduct these experiments at that particular scale. And so grazing is one I think of a lot. And of course, temperature, I think, would definitely, hot drought, which I think is more common than what we impose, I think would definitely exacerbate the patterns that we saw.
Thank you. So I see there is a question from David Ward. He says, fascinating talk, Alan. Thank you. Brad Ripley has been studying Aloteropsis species in South Africa where they can be C3 and C4. Could it be possible that something similar happens with wheatgrass?
I don't think that wheatgrass has that ability to be facultative, C3 and C4, so I don't think that's the case, but that's a fascinating idea. It's fascinating to think about your part of the world where you basically don't have a lot of C3s as far as I understand, but mostly C4 grasses. I was actually talking to one of my former students, Tony Swimmer, about this after we discussed some other issues, and we were thinking about, are there early and late season C4 grasses in your part of the world that might also shift in their abundance if indeed seasonality precipitation changes during droughts or even not during droughts in the grasslands of South Africa. So it's really easy to see when C3s and C4s are so distinct from each other, but I don't think this precludes even just early and late season species responding differently to any kind of shifts in precipitation seasonality, really driven by drought or just climate change in general.
Great. Sally has her hand up, so we're just going to unmute Sally, and then I'll get to Joris's question and Mark, I assume Mark Peel, I'm not sure. Go ahead, Sally.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. It's really a lovely talk, and it really helps me think a little bit more and understand better the shifts from C3 to C4 dominated grasslands over the Miocene as well. As systems became more seasonal and rainfall happened more often during hot periods. So that has been nice for me to think about. I was just wondering, I always think, I know it's a big generalization, but I think of C3 grasses, I actually think of C4 grasses as being quite bad in droughts because they don't really regulate their stomatal control. They just use water when it's there. And I've noticed, in a drought year, you don't have any rain, then you have a rainfall event, and the C4 grasses just go for it. And then the rain goes away again. And so a C3 grass, which regulates its stomatal control a little bit more, I've always thought that might be, it never seems strange to me that C3 grasses expand under drought, but the mechanism that I used to explain it was more that C3 grasses show more stomatal control under limited water than C4 grasses do. Is that something you've thought about? I can see that in your experiment, the seasonality of growth and links to temperature are really persuasive, but I wonder if you've thought about the physiological control idea as well.
I have not. I think that's a great point, Sally. Hello to you, by the way. I think that's a great point. And I think like in your part of the world in particular, where you tend not to have the really cold and really warm seasons or tropical systems in general, that mechanism might be more important. Well, obviously it has to be more important than cool temperatures versus warm temperatures if you don't have those swings. I've actually noticed in my much more limited time in South Africa than others would have, I've actually noticed what appears the same thing to me. That is the really flashy nature of the C4 grasses in terms of them, as you said, going for it when the rain comes and exhausting that rainfall and essentially shutting down afterwards. We do not see that pattern. At least it's clear in comparison, we don't see the same sort of pattern in North America. Now that could be due to the fact that our rainfalls just aren't quite as flashy as yours. We don't have a dormant season due to drought, right? We have a dormant season due to cold. And so we tend to start every growing season with the soils being relatively wet, right? And so the grasses have a reservoir to build on at the start of the year. So we tend not to see that the flashiness that you're talking about, but it was in the time I've spent in South Africa, I totally agree. It's really obvious what happens there. Again, I was really unaware of many C3 grasses that might compete with them, at least in the parts of South Africa I work with. But I think that mechanism makes a lot of sense in terms of stomatal control giving an edge to C3s. And I also agree that it's a generalization that's in all the textbooks, but of course that C4 grasses are more drought tolerant, or C4 plants are more drought tolerant than C3 plants. That again, it's a generalization. It's based primarily on their physiology. That doesn't always, as you know, translate to success in the field.
Yeah, it's really great stuff. Thanks.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to Joris. He's wondering about the role of fire here, which is an important driver in these systems. How does it vary in your C3 versus C4 systems? And how would this interact with the drought and influence relative proportions of C3 and C4?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. So fire, very important in your part of the world, very important, at least historically, in our part of the world as well. If you think about that map I showed you of the central plains in the US, as you might guess, fire is not so much associated with C3 versus C4 as just productivity, fine fuel production in general. And so the historic importance of fire became greater as you move east to the more productive grasslands. Fires were important, and even in the more arid regions, of course, the frequency would just be much lower. With regard to water relations, what we've seen, again, in our part of the world, is that in mesic parts of the world, fire tends to reduce water availability. There's more water lost to evaporation, but the net effect of fire is usually positive in those mesic grasslands. As you move to the drier and drier grasslands, fire tends to result in a much drier system. The grasses, that loss of evaporation, or that increase in evaporation when you lose the cover of the litter on the soil surface, combined with drought conditions or just low rain conditions, make the system much more water stressed. So you could imagine fire during a drought having even a greater negative impact on soil water availability for plants than they would during more normal years. So I do think it would have an impact. The sort of flip side of that is fires, once you get that fine fuel removed from the system, as you would during a multi-year drought, there's just not much to burn. And in many of these systems, they burn best after wet years or during wet periods, not during dry periods when you just don't have the fuels to carry a fire. And so there's that interaction as well that you'd have to think about.
Okay, thank you for that. Mark Peel says, what impact does the state of the vegetation at the onset of drought have? If we are looking at differences of 1 week in driving some changes, this may be important.
Yeah, hi, Mike. That's a great question as well. I think the state of the vegetation would matter a lot. So one of the experiments we're doing is actually doing repeated droughts. And so, as Weaver pointed out during this period, he saw almost a 20-year signature of this extreme drought. But even if you drought our grasslands for 2 or 3 or 4 years, you can see the signature of that drought in terms of species composition and even productivity to a certain extent, compared to the undroughted plots for 3 to 4 years afterwards. And so we've started experiments where we're alternating 2 years of drought, 2 years of recovery, 2 years of drought, 2 years of recovery. And we're seeing sort of long-term changes in species composition, shifts between grasses and forbs that actually become accelerated over time and actually then change the resistance and resilience of those grasslands to future droughts. And so I think that tells us that the state of the vegetation does matter a lot, can matter a lot. And of course, that's another set of complexities, as Debbie talked about, in terms of thinking about how you predict how these grasslands are going to respond in the future as we look at drought regimes as opposed to individual droughts.
Great. Jeremy Shellner posts, how can this understanding of grassland changes in response to seasonal precipitation variation be used to develop land management strategies for resilience in the face of future drought?
Oh, wow. That'd be a seminar in itself, right? That's an awesome thing to think about over several vent hooks, which I wish I had in front of me right now. So we know in the United States, again, C3s and C4s, not only do they differ in their ecology, their ecological relationships, they differ in their physiology, they differ in their forage quality as well. The ranchers here actually want their grasslands to have a mix of those two species. They provide forage, of course, at different times of year. That's a management issue. They provide different forage quality as well for the animals they graze. And so you could think about drought and C3s and C4s from a number of perspectives, from stability of production overall, from the temporal dynamics of the production, from the forage quality of the production. Those would all be very complex issues. We try and manage, I'm not a land manager, but our ranchers try to manage now as best they can for the current climate, thinking about the future with increased drought, changes in seasonality, those sorts of things, really just suggest to me that many of those management strategies, which are designed to get a mix of both types of species, probably will have to be adjusted, probably will have to cope and deal with this. In some cases, you could imagine drought might have a positive effect on keeping the mix of C3s and C4s present, but of course, forage production would be much lower during those times. So I guess my non-answer answer to your very challenging question would be, I think this information will be valuable for anyone who's trying to design future land management scenarios for this region, given that this is something that's likely to happen more in the future.
Okay, I'm going to take the last three questions now from Kevin, Justin, and Tim. Kevin wants to know any smart clue how C3 or C4 grasses, exotic or introduced in other grassland ecosystems, would compare with the native C3 or C4 grasses.
Yeah. Did he say smart clues? Is that what he said? Well,
smart in inverted commas.
So we do have a lot of invasive grasses in North America. We have invasive grasses that have essentially converted non-flammable systems into flammable systems as a result of those. So whether those exotic species would behave differently, in other words, whether it's a species-specific phenomenon or whether it's a C3 phenomenon in general, whether it's related more to the photosynthetic pathway and the phenology of those species versus the individual species traits itself is really unknown. I would tend to lean towards again, in our part of the world, if we're moving precipitation to cooler times of year, any species that's better able to use those cooler temperatures is likely to be successful, whether it's a native species or an exotic species. So you could imagine it could, thinking about cheatgrass, which is the common C3 and exotic invasive grass here in North America. It tends to grow very well during the cool parts of the year. So you can imagine how drought then could actually increase its success in this part of the world. But I don't think it would necessarily be an exotic versus a native issue versus which temperatures they tend to do better at and when the rainfall occurs.
Great. Justin says, I presume that the grasses in that system are mainly tufted perennials. During the process of recovery after drought, do other life forms flourish, specifically annual and or stoloniferous grasses?
Great. So I should apologize. I did not give you the natural history of the grasses in this talk. I should have. In most of the Great Plains, all the grasses are perennial, the native grasses, and they tend to be, in the more mesic parts, rhizomatous, sod-forming grasses, as we call them here. As you get to drier and drier regions, they tend to be more bunch grass. But they're all long-lived perennial grasses. I can tell you that recovery after this drought, again, took a long time, but seedling establishment is relatively rare in these grasslands, as I think it is in most perennial grasslands. The established grasses are just so much better at occupying space. And what Weaver noted, even though he felt there was, and he documented much mortality in these systems, is that there were also bits and pieces of rhizomes that essentially lie dormant during the drought and resprouted. And so much of the recovery he saw, slow as it was, he felt was not due to new seedling establishment. It was actually due to those plants he thought were dead, that had been killed by drought, that actually were just lying dormant and hadn't sprouted for years, and then eventually sprouted when the rains came back. And so a lot of that recovery was from essentially quiescent meristems that were in the system. He did document annuals, an increase in annuals. Most of those annuals are C3s as well. Once the canopy, though, closed, and most of those annuals went away, that sort of the disturbance effect went away as well.
That's great. And the last question we'll take now is from Tim Hoffman. Do the American grasslands grade into shrublands along an ecotone, such as the case in South Africa, i.e. grassland Karoo ecotone? And if they do, then what happened after the Dust Bowl to the dynamics between these two biomes?
Yeah, you guys have amazing questions. Those would be something. we should be having this over a beer and discussing these things. So yeah, we do grade into shrub-dominated systems. So in two different ways. If you envision that map again of the Central Plains, as you go wetter and wetter, further and further to the east, the woody plant component tends to increase. And in fact, fire becomes essential to keep those woody plants from displacing the grassland. So much of the more mesic eastern side of the Great Plains is actually a tension between shrubland and grassland. And if you remove fire, as people often do in this part of the world, then the shrubs increase dramatically. But they were always there as a component. In addition to that, if you move southwest, right, there's a large shrub component as well. So, but the question you ask is fascinating. That is, during the drought, how would that impact sort of the relationship at the edges between more shrub-dominated and more grass-dominated systems? And to be quite frank with you, I've not read anything about that. I don't know what happened during that time. Much of the shrubland expansion that has occurred in the United States was actually driven by very different things in climate, oftentimes land management changes and overuse by land managers that have driven a lot of the expansion of shrubs. But my prediction would be is that our shrubs in our part of the world, probably yours as well, tend to be much deeper rooted and tap into much more stable moisture sources. So you could imagine, in at least a few experiments I've seen done, the grasses being more negatively impacted than the shrubs by a reduction in rainfall. And assuming those shrubs have the ability to establish and expand their range, you could anticipate that might be one outcome. But I really haven't seen those studies done or even read much about people pondering that particular question.
That's great. Alan, thank you very much for answering those great questions that we have. Kevin, I'll hand back to you now.
Thank you, Debbie, and thanks for handling those questions very well. And as I predicted earlier on when I was talking to Alan before we started, I can hear holidays in the background. I'm not sure whose house they're outside, but I suspect it might be yours, Debbie.
Apologies, outside my house.
Alan, thanks once again for what was really a very insightful and intriguing presentation. And I think what I really have taken away from this is your approach to research is a really good example of how to frame some broad research questions and then drill down to the required level of detail so that you actually develop a really good understanding of the dynamics of the system. And that's obviously what you've done there. And I think for students that are listening, it's a really good example of how to go about research in a really methodical way and the kind of Sherlock Holmes approach. So thank you very much for that. And we really appreciate the time and effort that you put into this. And we as the Grassland Society of Southern Africa have really benefited tremendously from this. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. And we'll probably get you back at some stage. And then I would just like to end off by asking the attendees, we have got a questionnaire available for you on the Drifter website. We would like some feedback on the seminar, not on Alan's performance, but on the seminar as a whole, time of day that we have it, and some suggestions for future topics and future speakers. I would like to just make a plug for the next two that we have arranged. On the 28th of October, Wednesday the 28th of October, we're going to have Dr. Sam Fuhlendorf from Oklahoma State University. And the title of his talk is going to be Animals, Fences and Fires, Heterogeneity and Grassland Management, which I think will be very interesting to us in South Africa. And then the next one, which will be on the 26th of November, will be Dr. David Brisky from Texas A&M University. And the title of his talk is going to be Reflections on 40 Years of Holistic Grazing Management Assessment, which is also very topical, and we hope to see everybody at both of those talks. So those are the next two that are lined up. They are going to be held at 5 in the afternoon. It's a very convenient time for American speakers. After those two, we will, if there's a consensus that we need to change the time of day to a more convenient time, we will certainly consider that. But for the next two, it's certainly going to be a Sundowner series. And we have, just for Alan's benefit, while he was having his coffee, I was having a Winterglager, living up to the Sundowner series name. Alan, thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And thanks, Debbie, for acting as chairperson, and thanks to Franey for the logistics and the technical side, which went off without a hitch, which is great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. We look forward to seeing you next time.